Pleiadian Perspectives on Human Evolution by Amora Kuan Yin. Episode 4, Part 2, Continued. Migrant colonists reclaim the original city, year 13,100. Men had stayed behind to burn the bodies and begin cleaning up the polluted waters. Therefore, by the time the victors returned, the city was ready for minor cleanups and habitation. The leaders of the army who had shown the greatest ability during the war set themselves up in the temples, which were converted to army and government-like offices. At first, their only jobs seemed to be to keep the army trained, beginning with young boys, and to oversee the development of weapons. Soon, more areas of authority were established. The common people were ordered to supply the needs of the army officers, which enabled the officers to focus exclusively on running the training camps. Jobs were created such as inventory control, weapons design, organization of competitive war games, and collection of goods from the people to support the army. Though there was no one else on Mars at that time, the need for protection and war preparation was considered eminently important. Within the next century, something similar to gunpowder was invented. Mining and forging of metals had to become an important industry, as had the invention of new weapons. The remaining Martians, especially the military men, longed for another military challenge. The need to fight in order to feel important and strong and prove their worth, as well as the psychological need to kill, was in their blood now. Their collective consciousness called out for an enemy to war with, and the enemy came. Lyran Orion invaders arrive, the year 13,200. There was a group of beings who had originally come to Orion from Lyra, defying the established order in that star system. The Lyrans had enslaved the indigenous Orion beings many thousands of years previously and become the warring rulers of all of the planets in one Orion solar ring. Orion is one of the stargates in this galaxy, which is why the Lyrans desired to control it. Mechanistic spacecraft, as opposed to the Merkaba light ships used by more spiritually evolved light beings, were among the Lyran technological creations. They also produced sophisticated weapons capable of mass destruction. The Lyrans had challenged the light beings of Orion for control over the entire constellation and all of its solar rings, but they had been outnumbered and unable to defeat the higher intelligence and higher spiritual superiority of their chosen enemies. Therefore, leaving behind most of the warriors and leaders in the one solar ring of Orion they did control, the Lyrans left Orion in search of more territory and power. Since Mars was the first inhabitable planet they came to that had a ready-made slave population, they landed there. Your solar ring in general appeared to be an easy mark to the Lyrans. They knew that if they were successful in taking it over, they would have control of another galactic gateway, what you call your sun. After exploring Mars for the best land and water resources, they discovered there was only one part of the planet that was inhabitable at all. This land was about the size of present-day California. It took them very little time to discover the Martians, and though the Martians outnumbered them about 2 to 1, The Lyran Orion beings were amused by the primitive technology of the Martian lifestyle and began a plan to capture the city. The Martians, who had wished for an enemy, got more than they had ever imagined possible. The Lyrans, who were quite strange-looking by Martian standards, landed their ship right outside the city and walked in, dressed in weapon-proof clothing and carrying laser weapons. The Martians gazed in shock as their new enemies fired at stone walls and blew them apart. The Martians soon surrendered. A few of the Martians put up some semblance of a fight, but by Lyran standards it was laughable, and the Martians who resisted were killed before they could fire twice. Everything had happened so rapidly that the Martians scarcely knew what had hit them. One morning they got up feeling like mighty warriors as usual, and by afternoon they had been turned into the whimpering, awestruck prisoners by these advanced space beings in weird clothes that repelled gunfire. Actually, one Lyran had been killed by a Martian by being shot directly in the face. Lyran rule was established at once, leaving the former governing Martians to join the rest of the Martians as servants and slaves. Women were taken from their homes and families. Children who were too small to work and still needed to be taken care of were removed from the city and killed instantly. The Lyrans had a plan to procreate and raise up their own race. Therefore, they had no use for anyone who needed care on any level. It was weeks before the Martian men even thought about how to get out of this mess and still survive. They whispered among themselves about their dilemma, but none of them had any answers. Life as slaves to the Lyrans was all that was left to the Martians, except death, and most of them opted for survival. The Martians were awestruck by the new technology brought to their planet, and some of the men even forgot about their miserable plight as captives in lieu of learning this technology. The learning came only when they were commanded to build new structures, excavate new building sites, mine the necessary minerals, and create plumbing systems, electricity, and even nuclear technology. Construction of the pyramid, years 13,210 to 13,400. The most unusual project of all was the construction of a huge pyramid that was being literally carved out of a hillside. The Lyrans told the Martians that when they completed the structure, they would have the power to defy the existing order in the galaxy and command respect from all other star people. The Lyrans believed that the pyramid alone would give them power over the sun. They did not realize that the persons utilizing such a structure need to wield a power that was beyond physical might and aggression. They needed to be able to create through thought and spirit. The Lyrans merely believed that whatever they projected through the pyramid would happen. They also had a special weapon planned for installation in the top of the pyramid. It took full-time work crews almost 200 years to complete the structure, and when it was finished, the Lyran spaceship was used to place a giant antenna made out of a mixture of metals unknown on Mars in the top peak. The Lyrans had brought the metals from Orion and had saved them for this purpose. When the Lyran leaders entered the pyramid for the first time and climbed to the upper chamber, the crowds of Martians cheered in delight. Soon, an incredible display of light burst from inside the pyramid through the antenna projectile and out into space. It was like nothing the Martians had ever seen before, like thousands of bolts of lightning all projecting at the same time from the same place. As the light reached high above the planet, a loud sonic boom was heard, and another cheer came from the crowd. Even the Martians, who had adapted to working for the Lyrans by that time, were beside themselves with excitement. When they asked what the pyramid and projectile were to be used for, they were simply told, "Whatever we want to use them for." During the 200 years of pyramid construction, other projects had been initiated as well. Many of the women and older children had been put to work in assembly lines, making weapons and assisting in nuclear testing. Occasionally, a guinea pig was needed to test the effects of these weapons on humanoids, and a woman, a child, or an aged one would be taken away from the city and exposed to radiation, or simply killed with the new weapon to test its power. Life had no value at all to the Lyrans, except as it served their purpose of absolute power and control. Since the Martian Civil War, during which all the original Martians had been killed, the equivalent of Earth's lower astral planes, or bardos, had been growing in the etheric realms of Mars. Murder, fear, control for power, and the devaluing of life in general had established a precedent that quickly grew into a nightmarish hell realm filled with manifested thought forms. These thought forms were a type of self-regenerating elemental that was initially created from repetitious negative thoughts and misapplied emotional energies. Souls became trapped at death in this illusion-based world, and denied, disembodied aspects of human consciousness roamed around there, just the same as is happening on Earth at this time. This type of astral reality regenerated and strengthened the distrust, fear, control, and other negative states in the people. The colony had become power-crazed and was quickly deteriorating into a population of mutants incapable of love or conscience. Experimentation using the new pyramid became the focus of the Lyran leaders. Unbeknownst to them, this was causing extreme atmospheric changes. The ozone layer around the planet was looking more and more like modern-day Swiss cheese. The mercurial lakes, which were already diminishing, dried up almost completely. This did not disturb the Martians or Lyrans, since, in their minds, the lakes had always been useless. Nobody knew about the importance of the lakes in maintaining the mineral balance and underground water flows. A unique process on Mars created water by means of synthesis, involving the sun's rays combining with certain minerals through the inverted flows of the liquid in the lakes. It was like a laboratory in which the combination of sunlight and specific minerals synthesized within the imploded molecular structure of the lake's liquid. The water then filtered through a leach-type field of shale rock at the bottom of the lake and ended up creating underground streams that would bubble up and overflow into artesian springs. It was the first time this system had been used in this galaxy, by the way. The people's ignorance and their lack of honoring the sacredness of all things, regardless of whether these things served a known practical purpose, were quickly leading to their own demise. The streams and springs had all diminished to half their original size since the end of the previous cycle. At that time, the planet's poles had shifted and given them more hours of sunlight than were needed for maximum water production. The result was an enormous drying effect. The Lyrans and Martians had not noticed this, since the change in the water tables was gradual, and they still had more water than was required at that time. Then, after their experiments, the changes began occurring more rapidly. 100 years after the pyramid was built, The lakes had become ponds. Many artesian springs had completely dried up, and the springs that were left had diminished in flow and barely met the accustomed needs of the colony. After another 50 years, people were dying of skin cancer, and water rationing and storage had begun. Another 50 years, and the slave classes were receiving barely enough water to keep them alive, and even the Lyrans were rationing their water supply. With each incremental decrease in water supply, the tempers and the daily violence increased. Normally, the Lyrans used violence only when they deemed it necessary to discipline the Martians, or to use them for experimental purposes. The slaves had value, so they wanted to keep them strong and healthy. Domestic violence among the Martians had been minimal because they were all slaves with no power over one another. The Lyrans began to take out their frustrations about the lack of water, too much heat from the sun, and diminishing oxygen levels out on the Martian slaves. People were beaten, raped, and occasionally even killed just for fun. The Lyrans experienced a false sense of power when they felt the rush of fear and pain they caused in others. The Martians became shorter-tempered with one another, and more likely to rebel against Lyran authority. This gave their oppressors more reason to inflict violence. Women and children were not safe around their own husbands and fathers, and the women were beginning to beat their own children. After the Lyrans had been on Mars for 500 years, total chaos prevailed in a police state with curfews and prisons. Many of the men were removed from their homes, kept in the prisons, and only taken out to work. By the time the Martian civilization was nearing the end of its third 5,200-year cycle, the planet was only able to support about 1/3 of its population. The only thing everyone was in consensus about was the need for more water and less sunlight. Pleiadians arrive and restore peace. Year 15,600. When the Pleiadian emissaries of light arrived toward the end of the 5,200-year cycle, as they had previously agreed to do, they were met with weapons, hostility, and threats. The Lyrans quickly learned they could not harm these new beings with their weapons, and found themselves powerless as a result. The Pleiadians ordered that all inhabitants of the planet be gathered together for a meeting. The Lyrans refused to bring the slaves from the prison, claiming that these people were criminals and must be locked up. The Pleiadians replied that these people were slaves and former criminals indeed, but not for the reasons the Lyrans believed. Because the timing of the planet-wide meeting was dictated by an absolute planetary law, the Pleiadians overrode the Lyran refusal. The Lyrans and original Martians alike were told that if they tried to harm anyone, whatever they intended to do to the other would happen to them instead. The Pleiadians would harm no one, but they had the right to impose the law of instant karma. The Martians were terrified to go against the will of their oppressors, but with encouragement from the Pleiadians, they began to head for the prison to release their fellow men. A few of the Lyrans charged forward to stop them, but as they raised their clubs to strike the slaves, the clubs literally hit the Lyran attackers instead, knocking the men to the ground. A gasp came from the entire gathering, and the Martians proceeded to the prison without further delay. When they returned with the prisoners, the Pleiadians laid out the rules for all of the existing Martian inhabitants, including the Lyrans. 1. Instant karma would continue for anyone attempting to use physical violence against anyone else for the next 50 years, until the Pleiadians returned again for the decision-making meeting at the end of the 5,200-year cycle. 2. The previous law of quote, consensus -1, unquote, would be honored by the Pleiadians during that time, except to remove the instant karma ruling. 3. The people had to learn to treat everything and everyone as if they had value, even if they knew not what that value was. 4. Each person must review his or her own actions in order to discover what he or she had done to create the present situation. The Martians protested, saying they were slaves and had no power to create anything. The Pleiadians told them that they had fully created their own situation and needed to review their own history to discover how they had done so. They also told the people about reincarnation and reminded them that they were the same beings who had been their own ancestors and were, therefore, responsible for everything that had occurred in their history. 5. Knowing they were constantly being reincarnated, the Martians needed to ponder why that was so and think about the purpose of their multiple lives. 6. Every man, woman, and child was to share equally in the water, since all of the people had co-created the current dilemma. 7. All decisions that would affect the whole must be agreed upon by consensus -1. Anything not agreed upon could not be done, and the person or persons attempting to do it would create their own instant death in the attempt to do so. 8. The Lyrans would not be able to use their ship to leave the planet until the next meeting in 50 years, due to their involvement in the current planetary karma. The Pleiadians compassionately explained to the people that they were not being punished, nor would they be. The Pleiadians' sole purpose was protection and execution of planetary law, as it had been predetermined by the Martians themselves at the beginning of the current 5,200-year cycle. The people were informed that this was a rich opportunity for the Martians and Lyrans alike to learn and evolve together, and that the Pleiadians truly hoped the people would do so. The Martians and Lyrans were without exception deeply and sincerely loved and cared for by the Pleiadians, who were their spiritual and evolutionary guardians. The inhabitants of Mars were told that they all had divine spirits and souls that were infinitely capable and valuable. After remaining with the people for a few more days to help establish the new order, the Pleiadians left. The next 50 years fluctuated between periods of total chaos and insanity and times of calm introversion, contemplation, and renewal. A few of the Martians began to feel remorse, but the majority impatiently waited for a chance at revenge against the Lyran invaders. The more the revengeful ones plotted their violent comebacks, the more they were haunted by nightmares about being tortured and enslaved. The more the remorseful ones went into their feelings and thoughts and tried to learn, the more they experienced the Pleiadians and their messages in their dreams, teaching them about non-violent alternatives and showing them possible loving futures. Dreams were the most powerful tool for subconsciously assisting the people. They would consistently experience in their dreams exactly what they had asked for and made their inner reality. A dozen of the Martians and 3 of the Lyrans began to remember nearly identical dreams about how to meditate and how to feel the essence in plants as well as in other humans. As they shared these dreams, they realized they were being given clues about how to help themselves. A few people experimented with these dream suggestions and were positively overjoyed with the results. They also discovered that they were able to achieve even better results when they meditated together, and so small meditation groups were formed. A big hurdle was crossed the first time a Lyran came to one of these meditation gatherings. At first, a chilled hush fell upon the people. And then 2 Martians at the same moment stood up to welcome the Lyran. They agreed this was an important step towards settling their differences and coming to understand one another. The numbers grew until nearly 1/3 of the people were meditating and doing feeling exercises together. Something akin to co-counseling was introduced, during which the participants would divide into groups of 3 and take turns sharing dreams, revelations, feelings, thoughts, and questions. After each one person shared, the 2 listeners could give feedback if the person wanted it. Otherwise, all they did was listen to one another. Then the participants would pair up and take turns trying to feel each other's energy by placing their hands on one another's chests and looking into each other's eyes. This was especially difficult for them all, and many gave up right away, feeling extremely self-conscious and afraid. Occasionally, someone would walk out in a huff, saying these exercises were all ridiculous and meaningless. Some who left returned later at another meeting, while others did not. By the end of the 50 years, over half of the inhabitants had gone to at least one such meeting, and about 1/3 of them had continued going on a regular basis. When the Pleiadians returned, the people of Mars were in consensus about nothing except the need for water and protection from the sun. The Pleiadian delegation spent many days hearing the individual and group concerns and conclusions, and then adjourned to sort it all out. It was clear that there was a diverse group on Mars. 1/3 of the population had begun to learn from their mistakes and wanted to continue learning and growing. Their group included about 12 Lyrans. Those who just wanted to be free to do whatever they wanted, including seek revenge and power, made up about the other 2/3. Within that 2/3, the Martian contingent was split between wanting to get revenge against the Lyrans and just wanting their oppressors removed from the planet. The Lyrans, who were part of the 2/3, were split between wanting to leave Mars and wanting to stay and return to their experimental and so-called rightful control. Because planetary rule for divine intervention and execution of planetary laws by Pleiadians had always been based on consensus of the humanoid population, and there was consensus only about the need for water and protection from the sun, these were the first things to be reviewed. The population was split on those issues too, however. Most of the Martians wanted only Martians to be able to make decisions, since the others were invaders. However, the Pleiadians explained that the Martians had technically invited the Lyran beings from Orion with their thoughts and intent, so the Lyrans had the same rights as all of the Martians. The people could not agree whether to make decisions based on consensus or majority vote. The Martians leaned toward majority vote since they were still a majority in population. The Lyrans leaned towards consensus since they were outnumbered and saw it as their only hope. So the Pleiadians said they would present at least 2 proposals since the people could not arrive at a decision themselves. When the group reconvened, the Pleiadians had 2 suggestions about decision-making and changes. The first was that the people move into 2 colonies, each run by consensus. Changes affecting the entire planet would have to be agreed upon by at least 2/3 majority of both colonies. The second option was for the Lyrans to leave of their own free will, taking all of their weapons with them, while the original Martians would remain. The Martians would then have to decide on consensus or majority vote. Either way, instant karma for violence against another would be imposed for the next 500 years, while all the inhabitants of Mars were given a chance to further learn and heal. With this last stipulation, all but a couple dozen of the Lyrans agreed to leave at once. If they could not rule and be violent at will, they saw no purpose in staying on Mars. Half the Martians were of the peaceful persuasion, while the other half wanted revenge against the Lyrans. Though the revengeful ones were not thrilled with the outcome, they were pacified that the majority of the Lyrans decided to leave. In fact, they wanted all of the Lyrans to leave if revenge against them was not possible. The peaceful half of the Martians disagreed and believed the Lyrans had a right to choose a new way of living if they so desired. The Pleiadians agreed with the latter group, and that part of the decision was acted upon within 24 hours. The Lyran ship left Mars with all of the Lyrans except those who wanted peace and evolution. They stayed behind. The meeting adjourned once more a few days later in order for the Pleiadians to make final decisions on the planetary laws. It was decided that the 500 or so Martians and the dozen Lyran Martians still made up two distinct groups. One had a spiritual and evolutionary focus. The other wanted the freedom to do whatever they desired, especially to develop technology like that of the Lyrans. The decision was reached by consensus that they would divide into two colonies, each able to draw upon divine interventions any time a consensus existed silently or consciously within the group. It was also decided that a consensus must exist either subconsciously or consciously among all inhabitants of both colonies before changes affecting the whole planet could be made. Other decisions were: 1. The Pleiadians agreed to bring about more water slowly, but said the people had created the holes in the invisible ozone layer and would have to stop using the pyramid to set off explosives in the atmosphere in order for the water levels to increase. 2. At the end of the next 500 years, the people would need to have evolved and developed consciences on their own, since the instant karma law would be lifted at that time. 3. The DNA had to be cleared of all incest that had developed over the past 500 years. The reasons were explained to the people. 4. Natural resources could not be bought or sold or controlled in any way by individuals. Water must be equally shared as long as any shortage remained. 5. One Pleiadian would remain with each group as a spiritual advisor and general consultant, but would impose nothing upon the people. The people would have to seek the Pleiadians' counsel in order to receive help. At the end of the 500 years, each colony could decide by a majority vote whether the Pleiadian advisor would remain or leave. The Martians agreed to all of the terms and prepared to divide the community within a few days. The more peaceful, evolutionary-focused contingent, including all the Lyrans, would begin a new colony elsewhere, since they had no interest in the technology or historical significance of the original colony and the buildings. The more militant contingent was happy to remain in the existing colony, so everyone got exactly what they wanted. Segregation into two colonies, year 15,600. The migrators set off, accompanied by the Pleiadian spiritual advisor called Ra. When they came upon the old colony where their ancestors had lived prior to the invasion and takeover of the larger city, they felt a need to stop for a few days and make peace with their past. Ra, upon request, helped them create a ceremony of purification, forgiveness, and envisioning for the future. Then they unanimously decided to continue their search for a new home, preferring a location that would give them a fresh start rather than a continuance in the old historical city. Another 2 weeks brought them to the edge of the fertile land, a vast desert spread out before them as far as they could see. The travelers headed back into the vegetated lands in a slightly different direction and found the ideal spot after another 2 days' walk. The water supply was the best to be found, though not overly abundant, although vegetation was varied and plentiful, and building materials, mostly rock, were readily available. There were also caves nearby, big enough to house at least the women, the children, and the older people temporarily. They had found the location for their new home. A dedication ceremony was held, during which the settlers established their commitment to honor the natural resources by taking only what they needed and to live for the purpose of evolving, learning, and becoming better people. They also dedicated themselves to creating and living in a way that would leave a positive heritage for their children and themselves when they returned through reincarnation. Progress was steadily made, with the construction of dwellings taking first priority. For nearly 100 years, the settlers established themselves in this new city, shared their dreams, and learned with one another. As the basic day-to-day lifestyle became easier to maintain, they turned more and more to Ra for spiritual guidance and advice. He told them that he could always answer their questions and give them what they asked for, but no more. At this stage in their evolution, it would usurp their growth to teach them beyond that point. The people asked to meet with him in groups at least weekly, and as an entire population 4 times a year at the times of seasonal changes. Even though the seasonal changes were not as distinct as on Earth, these time cycles were recognized and honored. For the entire 500 years, most of the people of the new city were like children, eagerly learning, opening gradually to being more vulnerable and emotionally honest with one another, and cherishing their times with Ra. When the end of this 500-year period came, the people were in such grief about the thought of Ra's departure that they unanimously agreed he should remain with them. Ra agreed, and the people held a festival in honor for him to celebrate the ongoing relationship and express their gratitude to Ra. They also decided to build a spiritual temple dedicated to Ra and constructed in his likeness. It would serve as a reminder to future generations that spiritual evolution was why they were alive. The fact that it would be shaped like a humanoid head, Ra's head, would give that message, since he represented the greatest aspiration to become divine humans. This temple was a huge undertaking, but also a mission of love. This is not the face on Mars, although it is connected to it. This will be revealed as the story unfolds. The temple was approximately 1 present-day city block inside. It was both carved from existing rock knolls and augmented with rock and mortar structuring. It took about 25 years to complete, since technology was rather primitive. In the meantime, the older city rebuilt its culture slowly and clumsily. The limitation of no physical harm to others without harming themselves had left the Martians with no basis for the creation of any kind of rulership. Their lives were easier than the enslaved lives of previous generations, yet the people were bored. At every turn, obstacles to technological growth were met. The metals brought from Orion by the Lyrans were gone, and the little water and too much heat created circumstances with no means of extensive mining, and no one could be forced to do it as before. Occasionally, someone went to the Pleiadian, who was also called Ra, for advice, but most found little use for him, since all he could do was answer questions about evolution, right action, conscience, and spirit. As a group, they did agree to ask Ra to settle disputes and make decisions for the collection, which he did. Once there was a big argument about whether or not experimentation with the pyramid should be done as long as no blasting was involved. Most of the people were frightened of the pyramid in general, while others remained fascinated by its omnipresence. Ra told them that the pyramid was like a giant energy generator, and in and of itself was neither good nor evil. How and why it was used determined its impact. It was decided that, as long as at least 12 people at a time were inside the pyramid and doing nothing unless they all agreed, experimentation was acceptable. Since the people had asked him about the dangers of the pyramid, Ra warned them of the power of their own unconscious thoughts and feelings. They thought this remark was unimportant and vague, and proceeded with the embarkment of the first group of 12. Since this was the most exciting thing that had happened in 25 years, it created quite a stir. People gathered around the base of the pyramid to watch as the first group of 12 ascended its steps. Though scorching in the sun, the Martians remained watching until the 12 descended that evening. The group had very little to report except for some details about the construction of the inner chambers. A new group of 12 Martians went inside the pyramid each day for several days, since many of the people were curious and wanted to see inside it. Each day the group returned with little, if anything, new to report. Occasionally, someone would share that he or she had experienced strange or eerie feelings, or had caught fleeting glimpses of light sparkling while inside, but these experiences were few and not taken seriously. There was still some equipment inside at that time, but no one knew what it was or how to use it. A few of the more sensitive and curious ones, those who had experienced the unusual feelings or visions, continued going into the pyramid after the initial trend had died off. But for the most part, the pyramid sat empty most of the time. One day, one of these more persistent and sensitive people thought to ask Ra more about the pyramid. Excitedly, he and a few friends went to Ra, told him what they had experienced inside the pyramid, and asked him what it meant. Ra told them the pyramid's shape had the ability to receive, hold, and generate energy. It also had an intimate connection to the sun and to elliptical orbits and time cycles. He explained that the Lyrans had built it to harness destructive power and had believed it to be the ultimate weapon. They had intended to use it to eventually take over the Milky Way galaxy, though they had been naive to believe such a thing was possible. Ra went on to explain that the strange feelings and fleeting visions of light were to be expected inside such a structure, since the pyramid itself had a powerful force field and an energy tangible to those who had more sensitivity. When he gave additional information about third eye clairvoyance, as well as clairsentient capabilities of all beings, the people responded enthusiastically, asking how they could develop these extrasensory perceptions. Ra explained that they were a natural product of evolution and expanded use of the normal 5 senses, and that they could be accelerated with certain meditative practices. With the motivation of psychic and full sensory power, the people thought meditation could possibly serve a purpose. Ra taught them methods of beginning meditation to help them focus attention and energy, and said the meditators could come back for a lesson, and said the meditators could come back for the next lesson when they were doing well with that one. After a few months, several of the men and one woman came to Ra, saying they were ready for the next lesson. Ra asked them to meditate and hold a specific focus for half an hour so he could check their progress. Since they were doing reasonably well but needed more discipline, he gave them a walking meditation and an open eye meditation to add to their existing practices, and told them to return in 1 month for a review. At that time, all of the Martians who were meditating, about 24 people altogether, were able to hold somewhat of a focus for half an hour, so Ra took them to the next level. He gave the people a third eye exercise to do at dusk each day, using candlelight and a mirror. They were to sit in front of the mirror for 10 minutes, gazing into their own eyes only, using only the light from 2 candles, one on either side of them. All they were to do was watch their own eyes. After 2 weeks of doing this exercise daily, they were to do it in pairs and looking into each other's eyes, not using a mirror. After 2 weeks of doing the exercise in pairs, they were to return and report to Ra what they had experienced. After only the first few days, the group returned, saying they were afraid to do this exercise in pairs because they had seen some very scary things in the mirror while doing it alone. Strange and angry faces, sometimes even monster-like, had appeared in the mirrors. Several of the people had even seen the faces of their oppressors from Orion, as they had stared into their own eyes, and this had really scared them. Ra explained that he had given them the exercise to help them understand that they had many things going on inside themselves of which they were unaware. The images in the mirrors had been reflections or aspects of their own personalities, as well as past life images still inside them waiting to be healed. Although leery, the new meditators were willing to listen and learn and try again. Ra told them that before a being could learn to use psychic power safely, he or she must first purify themselves spiritually and emotionally. Their own repressed killer selves were still a very big part of their psyches and had to be transformed now, not just stifled out of fear of harming themselves. It was the first time any of this group had been willing to even consider anything like spiritual growth or healing, and they listened. Their main driving force was still the desire to understand power through technology and using the pyramid, but they had also experienced looking at the shadow side of their own natures and looking at it in the eye, and it had made some impact on them. Ra was then asked to teach them as a group, and individually if needed, how to clear these parts of themselves. He agreed to begin at once. The teachings left psychic phenomenon behind and began with deepening meditation practices and something akin to drama therapy. As the people brought the repressed parts of themselves to the surface, they could act them out, give them voice, and learn what they had to say. It took a while before any results were seen and felt. The people were extremely self-conscious and distrusting of one another. When Ra refused to teach them anything else until they participated fully in drama therapy work, little by little, they began to do so. Some of them dropped out of the group instead. leaving 18 people to carry on. After a while, the remaining people brought in their mates and children to introduce them to the processes they had learned from Ra. Most of the relatives joined the group, increasing the class size to about 40 members. The rest of the community remained detached from the group, yet watched them for noticeable changes over time. As the older members of the group died, their children and grandchildren carried on. A few dropped out along the way, but 30 to 60 members continued to participate at any given time. Progress was slow but steady, and as one practice was mastered, another would be introduced by Ra. Emotional clearing took precedence, while working on very basic morality and ethics through meditation and teachings was always a close second. These two priorities, as well as development of connection with their higher selves, took all of the focus for the rest of the 500-year cycle. At the end of this period, this minority group, who had worked so diligently with Ra, felt that the Pleiadians' presence was crucial. Many of the others had used Ra's wisdom in more practical ways over time, while others were neutral about his presence and remained free of contact with him at all. So, when the time came to decide whether Ra would stay or go, all agreed he was welcome, at least, and wanted by most. The lifting of the instant karma rule also occurred at that time, as had been promised. Many were dubious about the removal of this restriction, but were reminded that they must evolve as a race through the use of free will. So began the next 500-year cycle, with both Ra's staying, one with each group. The group of meditators and self-healers continued working with Ra, transmuting and transforming slowly but steadily. The Martians were a proud and willful group, skeptical by nature, so their progress was at times tedious and accomplished with much resistance. At other times, they broke through that resistance and surged ahead. The rest of the original colony members went on with life as usual, making normal evolutionary growth in living conditions, food production, medical treatment, mostly with plants and minerals, and technology. They created a new method of cooking using solar energy, which led to general studies of and inventions using solar power. Greenhousing was developed as a way of growing plants that needed more moisture than they could provide. This increased their food choices tremendously. For the next 500 years, life on Mars followed gradual and consistent patterns of growth for both colonies. Those 500 years brought a few more challenges, however. Some of the bacterial and fungal forms evolved into parasitic, almost insect-like species, with a focus on plants as feeding grounds. These tiny creatures destroyed much grain and many trees and other plants before the people had any sense at all of what was going on. Both cities were greatly afflicted by this plague, though the original colony was hit the hardest. By the time they discovered what was causing the problem, much damage had been done to the food and building material supplies, and to the fibers used for production of clothing and paper. When Ra was consulted with regard to what could be done about the parasite problem in both cities, they told the people to go to the lakes and gather the mineral deposits around the edges of the liquid. These specific mineral deposits contained ingredients that had leached into the soil and rocks in great quantities. As the water levels and rains had diminished, the chemical makeup of the soil and water had changed gradually. The mutated life forms were now seeking what they needed to survive in a new place, the plants. Ra told the members of both colonies to powder the lake minerals and spread them on the ground everywhere the plants grew. They were to begin with food plants, herbs, and trees, and then spread to more common vegetation after the essential ones had been fertilized. These powdered, rock-like minerals would give back to the soil what was missing due to the changes in the water tables. Some moisture would be required to accompany the fertilizing, but in the garden areas, the normal watering of plants would take care of that need. The people were also told that it would take 6 months to a year before the results would be noticeable, but to have faith it would definitely work. The Martian colonists were really learning about the long-range effects of interference with the atmosphere. They were witnessing how the activities of the Lyrans and their own ancestors over 1,200 years before were still creating ongoing problems in their natural world. Ra was able to tell about the symbolic and actual nature of all events, whether they were perceived as positive or negative. Basically, he explained the principle of cause and effect, saying that each action or result is the direct effect of a traceable cause. For many of the people, this was a powerful learning that had impact on many levels. For them to examine their actions and thoughts for what they had the potential of producing was a big evolutionary step in consciousness. Unfortunately, many of the Martians living in the original city simply used this understanding as a reason to dredge up old blame and hatred for the Lyrans. These negative feelings festered into an open wound in their emotional lives over the years. Their hostility and blame had been deeply buried during the time of instant karma and had remained mostly hidden for those 500 years. Now, however, their DNA was ready to be purged of those emotional and mental patterns. The bacterial and fungal plague had served to bring denial and repression to the surface. Tempers were shorter. Emotional dramas about small problems were exaggerated. Mild cases of violence began to show up, and tension was prevalent throughout the population of the original colony. The meditators of that colony were more prepared for this than the rest. They had been clearing their DNA more actively for many generations. These meditators had tended to marry within their own spiritual community, thus assisting in the genetic clearing even more. They offered to start teaching the rest of the people about stress management, emotional clearing, drama therapy, and anything else those outside the spiritual community were ready to try that might assist in the clearing of these new, old problems. Most of the people negated the whole idea, as usual, although some of the women and children, and a few of the men who really did not want to get back into the old ancient ways of violence and extreme oppression, volunteered to receive help. This added a total of about 40 new people to the group of those trying to heal, bringing their number to around 100. The entire city's population had grown to about 325 people. So even though the meditators were still a minority, they were a significant minority of about 1/3. The polarity between the groups in the original city grew rapidly. By the end of the next 500 years, the peaceful segment of the population was obviously in opposition to their neighbors, who were becoming more and more violent. Early on, during the growing segregation, the peaceful ones tried to make the others understand. However, as the violent patterns accelerated over a few generations, a deep cultural and spiritual chasm was formed, with prejudices and judgments against the other in each group. At the end of that period, a majority vote could not be reached about Ra's presence in the city. The vote was almost exactly 50-50. Original city divides, year 17,100. When Ra announced he would therefore be leaving, The peaceful contingent was extremely troubled and begged him to stay. He told them he could not remain unless those who wanted him there left the city and began their own colony elsewhere, or joined the other colony that had split apart 1,500 years before. Over 100 people asked to be led to the other colony in hopes of healing their connection with their fellow Martians and finding a peaceful and safe home again. After consulting with the Pleiadian Higher Council and the group consciousness of the other city, Ra told those who wished to continue consciously growing in peace that they would be welcomed in the other city. They would be expected to follow the established order upon arrival. Delighted, they prepared for their long journey, and with Ra leading the way, they set out for their new home. The remaining citizens of the original colony were reluctant to let these people leave, for they secretly knew that the peace-seeking migrants had helped keep what balance remained in the city. Some of those who left even had second thoughts about leaving for exactly the same reason. They wanted to help maintain the balance and give their less evolved neighbors another chance to change. However, even with this compassion and concern about the colonists left behind, they knew that Ra's presence was essential to their own continuing evolution. Therefore, the decision to leave was unanimous among the meditators. The migrators found their way to the new city in just under 4 weeks. They were welcomed gloriously with feasting, celebration, speeches, and ceremonial gatherings. Even new clothing and temporary dwellings were festively prepared. It was a wonderful reunion that lasted for over a week. Then the inhabitants got down to the business of planning and creating new dwellings and introducing the newcomers to their laws of order, spirituality, agricultural techniques, and birthing practices. It was fascinating to the new people to see how the residents were much more advanced spiritually and culturally, and much less evolved technologically. As the integration of the two groups began, there was a common feeling of déjà vu among the people, accompanied by a sense of foreboding. When they approached Ra about the widely shared feelings, they told them the story of that first colony split on Venus due to incest and prejudices about physical appearance. They explained the formation of the criminal segment in the original Venusian colony due to class division and prejudice, as well as the second split, after which the criminals joined the newer colony. Ra related the whole history of that experiment, which led to the criminal forces being banned from Venus and coming to Mars in the first place, and how the Martian culture now consisted of all of the Venusian beings. They also reminded the people of the split that had occurred on Mars between the other long-abandoned city and the original city, at which time the violent patriarchs had slain all of the members of the original colony and had taken it over. They said that afterward there was only around 250 Martians left on the planet, and they were exclusively the violent ones. Now the population had grown again until those who had been slain at that time were mostly reincarnated and lived in this newer spiritual city. Some of the people who had just journeyed to this new city were the original victims, and some were the patriarchs in the process of genetic and spiritual evolution. The people were all deeply moved by the stories of their own history of prejudice, power struggles, and separation. They vowed as a group to heal the split once and for all. Of course, they consciously meant to heal it within their own city, but the group's subconsciousness also meant to heal it with every historical enemy. This set a precedent of spiritual preparation for the time of healing and reunion that was destined to come. The original colony which was now down to about 215 members, was in a state of great unrest. Its members had something to prove, but they did not even know what or to whom. The people felt angry and full of blame and revenge without an apparent cause within their conscious historical memories. Daily life continued, but with an impending sense of need for confrontation with someone at some time in the near future. For the next 1,000 years, the two cities remained estranged and scarcely even remembered that the other even existed. The negative thought forms and amorphous lower astral planes in the original city grew rapidly once all of the spiritual and peaceful people were gone. Patriarchy reigned again on Mars in the original colony, devolving to the original state of male competitive games, brutality, oppression of females, and general unrest. The only difference between this time and the previous one was that technology and psychic control, as well as brute strength, were now sources of male dominance. Those who remained knew of the work to develop psychic awareness that was historically connected with the pyramid. Somehow, with Ra and the peaceful members of the community gone, interest in that area surfaced again. The men began to experiment with projecting their thoughts through the pyramid. There were no apparent results, but etherically their messages were received as an invitation to the Lyrans to return and settle their ancient differences through war. These men were seeking an enemy who would challenge them, and their karma with the Lyrans, who were still unconsciously connected to the pyramid, created a natural link. Since the newer city's citizens had made a vow to heal the split with all enemies once and for all, the invitation to the Lyrans was unanimous, though unconscious. The Martians soon found themselves faced with their ancient enemy again. Lyran Orion invaders return, year 18,500. Because of time and space restrictions, it was a few years before the Lyrans actually showed up. When they did, it was disastrous for the people of Mars. First, the Lyrans rounded up into the original colony all of the Martians from both cities who were considered valuable as slaves. All of the rest were killed at once, and the temple dedicated to Ra was destroyed. Since the invaders had been technically invited back by consensus, there was nothing the Pleiadian Higher Council or the two Ras could do to stop them. The two Ras, who could have made themselves invisible, chose to allow their bodies to be killed, thus freeing them from the etheric planes around Mars and allowing them to return to the Pleiades to work with the other Pleiadian angelic tribe members. Before the people knew what had hit them, they were under a Lyran police state with no means of self-protection. Approximately 3,000 years after the Lyrans from Orion had left Mars, they were back in full charge, determined to succeed at utilizing the pyramid as the ultimate weapon to gain control of the solar system. Reconstruction of the damaged or removed parts of the control system for the pyramid began at once. Slaves worked for long hours throughout the city, the top priorities being the Pyramid Project, restoring nuclear power, and weapons production. After only 50 years, the city was technologically ready to begin experiments again, which commenced with a great nuclear blast through the metal conductor at the top of the pyramid. The Martians tried to warn their captors of what would happen to the lakes, water tables, and ozone layer. This part of their history had been carefully passed down from generation to generation, so that it would never be repeated. The Martians who tried to warn the Lyrans to stop the experiments were met with violence and/or death. All seemed lost to Mars and its people once again. There was no way to reason with the Lyrans. The invaders were more callous, violent, and power-hungry than even the worst of the Martian patriarchs, who were quickly made subservient under Lyran rule. When the first atmospheric explosion was set off, a large earthquake measuring about 8 on the Richter scale of your planet Earth followed immediately with several smaller aftershocks. Though the pyramid itself sustained no damage, the city and its people certainly did. Over 100 lives were lost and several buildings collapsed. This brought the Martian population from the 2 combined colonies down to about 250 people, since many had been killed when the invaders first arrived. Cleanup and necessary repairs took several weeks. Since so many had died, housing was not necessary to be rebuilt. The Lyrans just rearranged the people, placing more than one family in some of the homes, and continued along with their technological priorities. Experiments, often followed by other earthquakes, continued throughout the next 50 years or so. There was an ongoing increase in the production of weapons, and several small rock pyramids were built around the base of the large one. Each smaller pyramid contained a sonic generator that was used to strengthen the effects of the large atmospheric blasts. The aim of all of this was to shoot sonic, psychic, and nuclear blasts at the sun all at the same time. The purpose was to unravel the evolutionary encoding inside the sun, change the orbital time sequence, and establish a new vibratory pattern that would allow the Lyran warriors to rule your solar system. The Lyrans knew the sun was a gateway to communication with Alcyone, the central sun of the Pleiades, as well as to the galactic center. If they could successfully close that gateway, then align it with the specific Orion sun held by their fellow rebels in that Orion solar ring, they could technically overflow the Pleiadian forces of light, who were the guardians of your solar ring. This way, they could establish new territory for the dark forces in this galaxy. The timing for their experiment was very specific astronomically and astrologically, of course. Certain alignments needed to be exact in order to accomplish their goal. That goal had been missed the last time by only about 125 years, when the original Lyran invaders had left Mars unexpectedly. This time the alignment would occur before the 5,200-year cycle was over, and therefore the Pleiadians could not stop them again. What the warring Lyrans did not know was that the sun's encoding and the sun itself exist in a higher dimensional frequency and cannot be impacted, as the Lyrans thought, by lower frequency energies. When they sent the energies into what appeared to be the physical sun, this space would actually be in another dimension and therefore beyond impact in the way they intended. When the time for the long-awaited blast actually came, the sundials and geometric configurations within the pyramid's structure confirmed the alignment perfectly. Synchronization of the sonic, psychic, and nuclear projectiles was all in order and ready. When the exact time came, everything went off as intended, but the results were far from what was planned. There was a loud boom, accompanied by sonic waves. The collected and concentrated astral and psychic energies and blasts of light. A giant hole opened in Mars's atmosphere, creating spontaneous combustion, and every living thing on the planet was vaporized in a matter of seconds. The planet's orbit was slightly changed, but no one and no living thing was left to experience it. The Pleiadians and other angelic light beings, knowing this was likely to happen, had gathered to assist when the blast took place. They had created great cones of light in the atmospheric holes through which the souls and spirits of those who wanted asylum in the light could enter. Almost half of the true Martians went into the light and were gathered into protective cocoons for transport aboard Pleiadian lightships to Sirius for healing. The dolphin and whale spirits on Sirius are master healers and regenerators of damaged souls and spirits who are being prepared for rebirth into form. All of the Lyrans and the rest of the Martian patriarchs were so anti-light that they turned away from the cones of light and remained in the astral planes around the planet. Eventually, an Orion delegation of peace from the fifth dimension came for the astral bodies of the Lyrans, who agreed to return to the Lyran star system in preparation for their next evolutionary step. The Martian patriarchs remained in the lower astral plane of Mars, lost to time and space, until the end of that 26,000-year precessional cycle, at which time the Pleiadians chose to remove them to karmic training schools that were established in the planet's atmosphere. Orientation with their guides in the between lifetimes zone and the Council of Elders was begun. Mars, as a planet and multidimensional space, was etherically cocooned for clearing and regeneration for many centuries following this explosion. During that time, Maldek was prepared for humanoid inhabitation. The karmic patterns on Mars were not removed, but they were neutralized into informational geometric symbols, or encodings. These encodings could not create negativity, but instead projected the message of Martian history into the solar ring's collective consciousness. The Pleiadians also agreed to chisel the likeness of the face of Ra, as he had appeared to the Martians, into the planet's surface. This record of the temple was crucial to the planet's ability to reflect its complete history to future inhabitants of the solar ring. Therefore, it was created several times larger than the original temple on the now completely dead, arid surface of Mars. Author's note: it is important to remember that many Martians did attain enlightenment, and that a few ascended. Therefore, the sacred map of transformation, transcendence, and healing of the Martian karmic patterns was created and still exists within the atmosphere there. Both polarities exist within the human race: male dominance and conquering mentality, as well as men who see women as equals and treat them with due respect. Misuse of sexual energy for ego gratification and lust exists, as well as tantric teachings and couples who share the sacredness and pleasure of sexual union. Violence exists and nonviolence, hatred and unconditional love. You can call on those from Mars who chose the light and ascended to assist you in learning those lessons and purifying the Martian karmic patterns that you still may carry. To those who lived on Mars and attained enlightenment, or at least spiritual alignment. I, Amora Kuan Yin, wish to honor the lessons you learned through the offering of this following poem. To those Martians who did not transcend the Martian ego, I also offer this poem as a transformative tool. The Impeccable Lover. Oh, gentle man, what do you see when you look out at me with eyes of desire and longing? Eyes that reach out and surround me with your heat and passion, passion of wanting. Eyes that say, I must have you. Eyes that plead, eyes that lust. Eyes that say, I've been lonely so long. Oh, gentle man, do not look to me with these eyes. Go back to the looking glass, the mirror, and look at your eyes with these eyes. Relief awaits you there. When you see the conqueror, the knight, the hungry man, tell that one to lay down his sword and surrender his armor and shield. Tell him the war is done. Then put your arm around his shoulder and look him in the eyes. And when his sword, his armor, his shield are locked up and put away, and when he has cried and called you brother, then, gentle man, may you come to me with your soul's light shining from behind your eyes, able to see the light and essence that I am. Then I will look back when I see the love and respect in your eyes. But if I see deception and lust, or the need to conquer and own, I promise you this, I shall look away. Oh, gentle man, how would you give your gifts to me? Excitedly, like a child who picks a flower for mother and then runs inside to receive her praise? Would you give to me to show how thoughtful and kind you are? How generous you can be? To impress me with your charm? To win my love and a reward? Would you give me what you think I want? And love? Oh, gentle man, please take all of your gifts to your own magical inner child, who awaits, so lonely and afraid, in your garden. For he is in need of your caring and presence and your gifts. Take this child, hug this child, cradle him, stroke his hair, shower him with love, and be sincere. Alas, when he sleeps in your arms, lay him down softly, and then climb the stairs to my room. And if you see the light of my soul and the beauty that I am shining beneath my door, and you wish to honor me with a flower, a poem, a sweet word, or a kiss, then give to me with sincerity, without the need of flourish, without expectation or hope of reward, but with the quiet dignity with which you sniff the aroma of sweet-scented flower, or watch in peaceful awe the setting of the sun. Oh, gentle man, please burden me not with the weight of your esteem, or with the power to give or destroy your joy, your heart, your image and worth. For this responsibility is far too great a weight for me to hold. Go find your peace and happiness, your self-esteem and love. Find them with God and with Goddess. Find them in flowers and trees, in the wind and the setting sun. Then bring them with you for sharing. Do not make me your reason for living or dying. Do not make my approval the source of your power, nor my touch your salvation, nor my eyes your self-knowing, for I would grow to despise you, and you would resent and loathe me. This power that you would give me, I truly do not receive. At best, it could only serve to soothe the doubts I hold, and make me feel important to you, and needy and worthy, filled with a false sense of purpose, but fleetingly. And you would imprison me away from my own sense of essence, and from the truth of my soul, and from the goddess that I am, and from my true power and light. You would cripple me, surely, admiring me with your eyes that hide your loneliness and need, your gifts that beg for approval, your words of praise that hide your desperation. O gentle man, until the child sleeps and is peaceful in your garden, and the knight has lain down his sword, his armor, his shield, then, only then, approach my stairs and come up. And only then will I meet you halfway down. When your soul is present and shining brightly through the eyes of love, then you will see my eyes shining and looking back at you. When you give from your heart and your words are not boasting, when you know who you are without me, then I will be free to receive you and to give you fully my love. For then we will know that neither of us can be destroyed. The surrender that only can come to two who have first surrendered to self, to their own inner beauty and wisdom and essence divine, will be ours. Then, side by side, in blended light, our twin stars will shine once again. Just as I completed transcribing this poem into my computer, I noticed a beautiful buck with large, four-pronged antlers about 50 feet outside my window. I recognized him as the same deer who stopped and listened to me singing from time to time. From the first time we saw each other, there was a special connection. He would cautiously walk closer as I sang to him and threw him food. He would cock his head back and forth and look me in the eyes from a safe distance of many feet away. But this day we truly met. Upon seeing him, I ran upstairs and filled a bowl with grapes. Then I went outside and sat on the ground about 30 feet from him. He watched me continually through the corner of one eye, and I felt he was slightly agitated and more cautious than before. So I sang to him, one song after another, until he finally turned toward me. I noticed that he did not open to me until I became more centered and quiet inside myself. I complimented him on his discernment and then telepathically asked his name. The reply I heard was, "Feel my essence. That is my name." As I closed my eyes and felt his energy, the name Ernest entered my mind in response to his essential nature. Slowly, Ernest walked to about 12 feet away, stopped, explored the ground looking for some grapes that I had tossed earlier, and ate the ones he found. After that, he walked to within about 6 feet from me, where I had tossed a few more of the sweet enticements. All the while I sang and talked to him about my recognition of his sacredness. I sang, "You are so beautiful to me," and "Beauty of Life," which are songs that I wrote. I made up verses about the peace that will come to animals and humans alike when we are finally safe to trust one another. I sang and told him that he and I could begin that peace now. And as my heart overflowed with tears streaming from my eyes and my voice choked, he ate from my hands. His eyes were within a few inches of my own, his pronged antenna hovering over my head. He alternated between looking directly into my eyes, which continued to overflow in tears of gratitude, and relaxedly looking at the food offerings he was enjoying. At one point, Ernest nudged the bowl that was sitting on my lap, and I placed it on the ground in front of me. While he heartily devoured the rest of the grapes, each and every one, I took one for myself. I ate it as he watched me with furrowed brows that reflected his question. I told him, "I share the food I brought you in honor of our sacred communion." The puzzled look left his face, and he continued eating the rest. Once finished with the contents of the bowl, he nudged my hands, which I extended to him, now empty. After licking them and nudging them with his cold nose a couple more times, he stood still and looked directly into my eyes as I wept. Our souls bonded. As he walked away, I said silently, "There are a few more grapes there to your right." He immediately stopped and looked directly at them, walked over and ate them, and then walked away. I said, "Namaste," silently, and held my hands together until he was completely out of sight. I know he understood. This incredible gift was a confirmation to me of the vision of balance, respect, and trust that males and females are meant to re-find. And it was a confirmation of the vision I, as well as many others, have held of humans and animals living in harmony, respect, and trust once again. It is the vision of the purified and exalted Martian energy when in balance with Venusian love and appreciation of inner beauty.